But we're talking about a foreign government that, using technical intrusion and lots of other methods, tried to shape the way we think, we vote, we act. That is a big deal. And people need to recognize it. It's not about Republicans or Democrats. They're coming after America, and they will be back because we remain, as difficult as we can be with each other, we remain that shining city on the hill, and they don't like it.
While giving us insight into Trump's modus operandi in the White House, James Comey also reminded us of how this investigation all began. Russia interfered in our election. A new Daily Beast article by a friend of this show, Naveed Jamali, highlights another issue in the equation: the failure of our intelligence community to identify and stop the interference. According to Jamali, there are technological and operational gaps in our counterintelligence that we need to bridge in order to fight potential Russian influence on future elections. And joining me now is the man who wrote that article, Naveed Jamali. He's also a former double agent. And also with us is criminal defense attorney and former CIA special agent Jack Rice. And Naveed, I'm going to start with you. Your article is called Can U.S. Spies Reinvent Themselves After the Russia Hacks? Explain to us, what are these gaps and what do we need to do to fix them?
Well, the first thing, Joy, is we have to start with the understanding that, look, in 2016, as the 17 intelligence agencies assessed, the Russians launched an influence campaign to undermine our election. They did so by specifically trying to help one Donald J. Trump, and that, in fact, that candidate was elected. So, by definition, that campaign was successful. And if we start with that premise, that that campaign was successful and that it impacted not maybe the physical numerical value of the vote, but it nonetheless impacted the way people vote, it undermined our confidence in our federal election system, then the Russians were successful, and the counterintelligence community failed to detect and neutralize this threat. And if we start... Go ahead.
Well, just really quick, because I want to make sure that people, firstly, they should definitely read your article. You actually reference a June 2015 New York Times article in yours, where they talk about this army of well-paid trolls that are trained to try to wreak havoc all around the internet, working from this building in St. Petersburg, Russia, trolling our elections. The Republican argument has been that the Russians tried to interfere in our election, but failed because they didn't hack into voting machines. Are you saying that that premise is wrong?
Absolutely. The premise that the numerical vote was not changed is correct. However, look, a layman can see going into the election that the release of WikiLeaks, the fake news that was put out there, clearly impacted how people actually voted in the voting booth. And to sort of pretend that that didn't happen is completely disingenuous. And as long as we have that sort of partisan rhetoric that's floating around here, we're not going to address the core issue, which is, look, the Russians spent a tremendous amount of money and effort preparing for this operation, and they were able to influence how people voted, and that's incredibly
What should our intelligence community have done?
Well, I think that the first thing is the goal of counterintelligence is to detect and neutralize foreign intelligence operations. The simple fact is that going into November of last year, we didn't know the extent, the American public didn't know the extent of this operation. And I think part of it was whether they failed to convey this to the president, whether they failed to detect it, is a big question. But in terms of the physical things that they could have done, look, we have a big problem with social media. A lot of people get their news from that. There is, we see fake news. There is this big gap where law enforcement, you can't go after a fake news article and say it's broken the law. It's up to Facebook and Twitter in many cases to identify these and police it themselves. And look, they don't have an incentive to do so. So as long as they don't have that incentive, people like states like Russia are going to continue to use that, what I call a gap, to take advantage of pushing disinformation across social media, and that's that's a pretty big deal. And
Jack, one of the arguments that you hear from either Trump defenders or sometimes some on the left is, well, the U.S. does this too. We try to interfere in elections around the world, so why are we so up in arms that other countries try to do it too? As long as they didn't hack the voting machines, why is this such a big deal? Your thoughts?
Pretty simple. The real problem is that it works. I mean, the ability to go in and manipulate an election is what intelligence organizations do. The idea that Donald Trump tried to make the argument that this never happens is laughable at best. We can look back at the interview that was done with Vladimir Putin where he denied it. My attitude is, if you're not doing it, it's because you're incompetent. The problem is the Russians are doing it. The Russians did do this. They did this effectively, consistently, and that's what's important. To simply say, well, the Americans do this too. The fact is in intelligence organizations do this, but the Russians absolutely impacted this election. They may not have gone into the ballot box and changed one vote from a yes to a no, but they manipulated many, many people along the way to make the decisions that they did when they went into the ballot box. That's the fundamental point that needs to be looked at.
And so, Naveed, if these are influence campaigns, meaning they're not hacking into machines, they're hacking into people's minds, basically, and getting people to be of the affect that, well, I won't vote for Hillary Clinton because she, sold uranium or she's murdered 40 people, and sort of convincing people those things are true,
right,
and then getting them to act on those false beliefs. What can the intelligence community possibly do to counter that? That's people's own personal belief systems that they're getting off of Facebook articles.
Well, that's exactly right. And I think, this is a problem. We live in a free society. You can't, we've got to respect that. On the other hand, to Jack's point, look, just being aware that the Russians were, in fact, launching a campaign. And look, my goodness, come out and say it was successful. To have the President of the United States, we heard one of the most shocking things that we heard in the Comey testimony was the fact that the President never really, after January 20th, never seemed to have any interest in following through with what the Russians did. How can we counter this? How can we build this up? At a minimum, Joy, look, we need to have a separate entity here that's looking at this and saying, the question you just asked, how do we stop this? How do we inform the American public that this is happening? I mean, I think that's perhaps the biggest part here is the communication, the information. That's what we need to focus on.
And Jack, after the Iraq War, in which the intelligence community was, quite frankly, misused by the former administration in order to convince Americans, in order to run an information campaign to get Americans to believe that Iraq had something to do with 9/11. Polls showed over 60% of Americans, something up to 70%, believed, yes, Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11. Given that context, is there any way that the United States government could get away with a counter-information campaign that said, hey, people that are reading this on Facebook, this is a lie from Russia, signed U.S. government?
That's the petrifying part. If we think about what it is that we've seen, what Jim Comey talked about with this oath to Donald Trump, my biggest fear is it's not just that it was made to Jim Comey, it was made to everybody else. We can look at the head of the CIA, DNI, we can take a look at NSA, everybody else. And the question is all of these people, are they being driven by Trump, by the Republican Party, and are they going to become just arms of it? We can't have that because we won't have credibility otherwise.
Yeah, and Naveed, last question, we'll go to you then. Is the reason why we're not having a reexamination of this is that on the one hand, Democrats don't want to land any blame on the previous administration for the intelligence failure, and Republicans cannot admit that Donald Trump was elected by anything other than his own genius?
I think that's exactly right. The reality is that whatever the Russians did started under President Obama. And look, the Republicans have put themselves in a position where if they admit that the Russians successfully influenced the vote, whether, whatever degree that is, that to them, I think, seems to delegitimize their platform. And I think that is why they won't push this forward.
It's all about legitimacy. Thank you, Naveed Jamali and Jack Rice. Appreciate you both. More AM Joy after the break.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.